Welcome back to T-Sequence Narratives. Tonight's story isn't about conflict. There's no argument to point to, no raised voices, no final conversation that explains everything. It's about what happens when explanation becomes effort, and effort quietly becomes silence. This is a story about emotional fatigue, about the slow realization that clarity, repeated often enough, stops feeling hopeful and starts feeling heavy. Listen the way this story unfolds, patiently. This moment doesn't rush. Some moments don't end loudly. They fade, quietly. This is one of those moments. The day I stopped explaining. I don't remember the exact day I stopped explaining myself. There wasn't a conversation that marked it, no sentence that felt final, no moment where I decided this is it. If you asked me when it happened, I wouldn't be able to tell you, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, softly, in pieces. At first, I believed in explaining. I believed that if something mattered, you talked about it. If something felt wrong, you clarified it. If someone misunderstood you, you tried again, slower, kinder, clearer. So I did. When something bothered me, I brought it up carefully. I chose my words with intention. I made sure my tone didn't sound accusing. I explained what I meant before anyone could misinterpret it. I explained why it mattered before anyone could dismiss it. I told myself this was what emotional maturity looked like, and in the beginning it felt right. They listened, they nodded, they said they understood. Those words meant something back then, because I believed that understanding naturally led to change. When nothing shifted the first time, I didn't think much of it. People don't change overnight. Habits take time to unlearn, so I waited. Then the same thing happened again. The same moment, the same feeling, the same quiet hesitation before deciding whether to speak up or let it go. I spoke up again. This time I explained it differently, more calmly, more logically. I told myself maybe the first explanation hadn't landed the way I intended, so I clarified. I added examples. I softened my language even more. They listened again. They always listened. And slowly that became the problem, because listening without change starts to feel like a pause, not progress. After a while, I noticed something about myself. I could predict these conversations before they happened. I rehearsed them internally, edited them down, removed anything that felt too emotional or inconvenient. I learned which parts of myself were easier to receive, which truths needed to be diluted to stay acceptable. Each explanation became quieter, more careful, more contained, and I told myself that meant I was growing. But something else was happening too. I was getting tired. Not angry, not bitter, just tired in a way that felt heavier than frustration. Tired of translating my feelings into something more manageable. Tired of explaining why something mattered instead of it being obvious. Tired of carrying the responsibility for clarity alone. There was a moment, small, unremarkable, when it finally clicked. I was halfway through explaining something I had already explained before. I recognized the rhythm of my own words, and suddenly I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. They already knew this, not because they'd changed, but because I had already told them, more than once. I finished the sentence anyway, out of habit, out of politeness. But internally, something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to be permanent. The next time the same issue came up, I felt the familiar urge to explain rise and then fade. I paused, And instead of reaching for words, I asked myself a different question. What would happen if I didn't explain this again? So I didn't. I let the moment pass. I told myself it wasn't worth revisiting, that not everything needed to be discussed. That felt reasonable at first, but then it happened again, and each time silence felt easier than repetition. Not because I didn't care, but because caring had started to feel one-sided. I began pulling back in small ways. I stopped initiating certain conversations, stopped correcting misunderstandings, stopped offering context when something felt off. If something bothered me, I sat with it instead of sharing it. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I wasn't trying to make a point. I just didn't have the energy to explain anymore. And quietly, without announcing it, I began to withdraw. Not enough for anyone to notice, not enough to cause concern, just enough to protect myself. From the outside, nothing seemed different. I still showed up, still laughed at the same moments, still participated. But internally, I had stepped back. I no longer reached for understanding. I no longer expected curiosity. I watched to see if anyone would notice. They didn't, and that realization landed heavier than any argument could have. Because arguments suggest something matters, misunderstandings suggest there's room to try again. But not noticing someone pull away, that suggests they were already standing alone. Over time, my expectations changed. I stopped waiting for follow-up questions, stopped hoping for reflection, stopped believing effort would be reciprocated. And with that, the disappointment slowly faded. Not because things improved, but because I no longer expected them to. Silence settled in. Not the uncomfortable kind, the steady kind. The kind that comes when you finally stop asking someone to meet you halfway. I didn't stop explaining because I ran out of words. I stopped because I finally understood the answer. They probably never noticed when it happened. From the outside, I likely seemed calmer, less reactive, easier. What they didn't see were the conversations that never happened, the needs that went unspoken, the version of me that quietly stepped back. Stopping explanation wasn't dramatic, it was acceptance. And once that happened, nothing ended loudly. It just faded. You've been listening to T-Sequence Narratives. Some decisions aren't announced. They're made quietly after effort has already been spent. If this moment stayed with you, there are more stories here that unfold the same way, without noise, without urgency. We'll continue next time.